Welcome to Petros Family Wealth YouTube channel. Today we're going to talk about a geared downside protection versus a hard buffer downside protection, and what are the differences, pros and cons, and why somebody might choose a geared over a hard buffer. Just in case you're one of those hardcore listeners that like these very technical explanation around a very niche product like structured notes, please go ahead and like, subscribe, hit that notification button, and go ahead and share on your social media. Would love to spread the word and the different strategies or different techniques that somebody can use around structured notes. So with that, let's go ahead and dive in. Before we dive into the details of a geared versus a hard buffer, I want to start with why would somebody choose a geared buffer downside? Why would somebody add this level of complexity as we're diving into some of the details and some of the examples? Why make it more complicated? And the shorter answer is it's a much cheaper or less expensive downside protection than compared to a hard buffer. Meaning, let's say you're customizing the structured note and you don't quite get the upside potential that you were shooting for, and with a hard buffer, if you switch to a geared, you might be able to have a similar risk profile, but then because it's cheaper than a hard buffer, then you can amplify potentially that reward side of things. So what I have here is an example of a 10% hard buffer versus a 15% geared, and a 20% hard buffer versus a 30% geared buffer. And the reason I paired those two together is typically when you're, again, designing these structured notes, the cost of that downside protection is very similar, even though you're adding a higher percentage to the geared. So let's just kind of go through a couple examples. So let's say you have a hard buffer of 10% at the end of the term of the structured note, and the market or the underlying investment is down 20. Well, that hard buffer, it eats that first 10% loss. So if the underlier is down 20, the structured note eats that first 10% loss, so the client is down 10%. Same thing if you go down 25 on the underlier, client is down 15. So you still protected somewhat the client on the investment side with that less of a loss than you would if you generally invested in the index itself. And the other side is I have the hard buffer of 20%. Same kind of story. Market's down 20, client got other principal back. Investment or the underlier is down 30, well then the client is down 10. Now for the geared buffer, so going back to the 10% hard buffer, a comparable cost or a slightly cheaper cost is a 15% geared. And what happens is that first portion of that buffer is very similar to a hard buffer. So geared buffer 15, underliers down 15, no problem, client didn't lose any funds. But it's called geared because it ramps up or gears up that potential loss the further away from that geared buffer. So if the geared buffer is 15 and the underlier is down 20, well, they're not down just 5, they're down 5.88. And it ramps up or gears up that loss. Same thing on the hard buffer of 20 versus geared buffer of 30. Again, the first 30% loss on a geared 30, client's protected, didn't lose the funds, but then it ramps up or gears up the losses beyond that point. And so as you go further, we want to try to identify what's the break-even point where the client would be kind of in the same position, what kind of downside profile would the client be in the same level of downside with a geared or a buffer. And for 10 versus 15, it's really at that negative 40% level of the underlier is when it starts to, the geared buffer starts to go beyond or lose more than the 10% hard buffer. And then on the 20% hard buffer versus 30 geared, you have to go beyond the negative 50% in order to have that same break-even point. So what I wanted to do is just kind of show a couple examples of a rolling 3-year and a rolling 5-year returns. So if in that normal 10% hard buffer versus 15 geared, we're really looking at a negative 45% return of the underlier over a 3-year or a 5-year period. And so I have on here S&P, NASDAQ, small cap index, the Russell 2000, and the Dow Jones. And what I created was this line here. So over a rolling 3-year returns, so if you kept buying it every single day, each of these indices, what happened 3 years later? And as you can see, generally positive. But during those downturns over those 3-year periods, you can see what the depth of each of those negative three-year returns would look like. And I highlighted here on this darker line where that negative 45% return, at what point, again, that hard buffer would have been better than the geared. And so you can see it's not very often. This goes all the way back to 1995. Then if we look at a rolling 5-year return period, because we have more time in a structured note as an example, it also shrinks that possibility or that probability of the negative 45% 5 years later. Longer time horizon, generally less risk over time. And you see that it really is one main period during the beginning of the technology bubble where a hard buffer, that 10% hard buffer, would have been more fruitful for the client than a 15% geared. So even though the geared amplifies that downside, that break-even point is typically so low that it might be fruitful to add that level of complexity and be able to explain to a client why we might have chosen a geared over a hard buffer. But if you can show them some of the probabilities here, hopefully that's helpful, and then that allows you to add potentially a little bit more upside potential on any growth or income note that you're looking at. So I appreciate you spending some time diving into the weeds with me. And again, if you like what we put together here today, please like, subscribe, and hit that notification button. Thank you so much.